We are taking you behind the scenes of the National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence.
With unprecedented access to the scientists pushing boundaries and shaping our future, this show will take you to the cutting edge and beyond.
And whether you're an expert yourself or just science curious, this is the show for you.
Welcome to the Turing Podcast.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Turing Podcast. Today on the podcast we welcome Dr. Miguel Arana-Catania and Professor Rob Procter from the University of Warwick, along with Dr. Felix-Anselm van Lier, who works at Oxford University. We'll be discussing their recent work in using machine learning to analyse large-scale peace dialogue transcripts with the aim to assist in armed conflict mediation. Miguel, Rob and Felix, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So before we get started, I'm just going to get you all to introduce yourselves. So Miguel, what's your background in research and science? How did you end up working with the Alan Turing Institute?
So my background actually is a bit different. I was working initially on physics, on particle physics. But during some years I was also involved in working with policy and local policy in Spain. And then I came in contact with Rob, and we have an idea on how to apply new machine learning language on these kind of issues, on policy and in particular on citizen participation. And yeah, we made a project, a proposal. We got a grant from Nesta, and then that evolved into a more regular collaboration. And then we thought that there was really an interest on developing this kind of applications of machine learning to improve dialogues, participation, and so on. And then also working with Felix, we found that there was this possible project on Yemen that we found very interesting, and yeah, here we are.
Yeah, Felix, tell us a bit about your background. How did you come to be doing what you're doing?
Yeah, so my background is public law and more specifically constitution making. I was working on constitution making for quite a while. And then I got really interested in the opportunities that technology might offer to better understand public input in constitution making. And so that's how I found Rob and Miguel's work here at the Turing Institute, and I dropped Rob an email and asked him whether he would be keen on collaborating a little bit. And then I joined the team, and from there I think we found different really interesting projects that were, some of which were connected to constitution making, others more broadly on participation in policy making and law making, and as well as on peace negotiations.
Fantastic. And before I go to Rob, you mentioned your team. So how many of you work on these projects together, and is it all the same people or?
Depends on the project. So now we're, for example, working in a project with the University of Oxford that is a bit larger team with other people working there. But I think probably we are the core part of the team who tend to work together, and then look who could be the interested partners on joining and collaborating. So it really depends on the application. Yeah.
Great. Well, yeah, Rob, what's your background, and how did you come to be professor and also working on these projects?
So I'm a professor of social informatics at Warwick University, and social informatics is the interdisciplinary study of the design, uses and consequences of digital technologies that takes into account their organisational and cultural contexts. And I've been working in this interdisciplinary field for many, many years. I became a Turing Fellow in 2016, and since that time my interest has been primarily focused on data science and AI, its applications, and how it can become embedded into different kinds of application contexts. And that really is how I came to be working with Miguel and then with Felix on what is now a range of projects where we're working with potential users of these technologies, particularly NLP, to help develop applications that will actually deliver benefit to them. And I have to say, our collaborations have proved to be very productive, extremely interesting, and I think we are demonstrating some impact within the general field of what I would call data science for public good. We are trying to deliver solutions to problems that actually can benefit broader society, as the examples I think testify, whether it's helping to support negotiations in mediation in conflict scenarios, or whether it's to help policymakers to understand evidence better, or to support citizens in their endeavours to input into policymaking.
Cool. And does the group or sort of research programme have a name, or is it Data Science for Public Good? Just sort of.
I think that's probably a good sort of overarching title for it as any.
I've certainly heard that be used before as a buzz phrase or something, like Data Science for Public Good. Do you feel like there's not just in your own research, but this is like an emerging sort of trend or field in of itself, or?
I think it's one that's becoming more important in Turing and beyond, because I think there's a realisation that we need to demonstrate how these technologies can be to the benefit of broader society and not just serve the interests of businesses, for example, and corporations. And so Data Science for Public Good is about thinking how you can bring society members into the process of developing technologies and understand their agendas, their needs and their requirements, so that they can also benefit from what is, a very significant field of innovation, which has potentially very dramatic effects for society. And of course, one of the objectives of data science for public good is to avoid harms that might otherwise arise from using these technologies in ways that are perhaps not properly informed by public need.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to think about in that, we live in a world now where AI and data science, but, however you might define them, computing techniques in general are affecting like almost every aspect of our lives, but the number of people who work on those things is obviously quite limited. Are they only doing these most advanced techniques for the purpose of business? And even in the context of research, how do we think about how they impact, wider society, and how do we involve the wider community and get people's participation in the ways that these technologies are used? So it's a really interesting whole area, and I know there's a lot of other people at the Alan Turing Institute who are interested in thinking about these kinds of things.
I think there's also something interesting with that, because in our projects, what we always try to do is work very closely with our partners. So, for example, in this project with the mediation organization who is in charge, in other projects, for example, with a civil servant, with local councils and so on. And we really try to involve them in the whole development and the whole research every day, every meeting, to be part of it. And this, I think we have seen a very interesting learning process, because usually these technologies still are a bit far away from the people who actually then are going to apply it. So it's a very interesting process where we try to explain what these technologies can do, what are the limitations, what are the possible applications. And it's also a very interesting part of the process, how they start to learn and understanding what really can be done, and how also then they start thinking on other possible applications. So I think we are in a very interesting moment where this is starting slowly, but starting to spread all over society, and people are starting to really be able to imagine what they can do with it and use it much beyond the original possible application. As Rob said, sometimes these technologies are developed by very specific companies who have very specific goals, and then we're trying to take this technology out of these goals to this public good and public impact. So I find it very interesting. Very
interesting indeed. Well, before we sort of do a deep dive on the project itself and how you're using data science for public good or machine learning for public good, so we're going to talk today about this conflict mediation project you've been working on. But could some of you talk a bit about the changing nature of today's conflicts and how mediation and peace talks are becoming increasingly complex, and why this is an interesting topic to think about in the first place?
Yeah, sure. I can take that. So Ukraine is now kind of proving to be a bit of an example. But the general trend in conflicts is that conflicts have become more complex, that is involving more actors, both state and non-state actors, that they are becoming increasingly dynamic, fluid, and protracted, and that they create situations where you have much longer peace negotiations, obviously, and with many more actors involved and many more actors to negotiate with. And so mediation processes in general try to assist. We haven't talked about the mediation process yet, right? Or do you want me to go on the...
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah?
So what is the mediation process?
So mediation processes in generally try to... are processes where a third party, usually a neutral third party, tries to help and assist parties involved in a conflict to prevent, manage and resolve a conflict, usually by developing some kind of a mutual and acceptable agreements. And because conflicts have become much more complex and protracted, these mediation processes have become equally protracted and complicated, and usually have several layers of negotiation with different types of actors involved, where often it's really difficult to keep track of what has been said and where parties stand. And this is, I think, where we have been approached to try to find a way of offering some sort of support in terms of orientating ourselves in what is happening in this process.
I mean, one of the consequences of these more complex and protracted negotiation processes is there's a lot more data for the mediating team to make sense of, in the form of transcripts or quite detailed notes of every mediation session. And so I think the feeling from the mediating team was that somehow perhaps data science and NLP could help them to understand that data better and help to manage the growing volume of data that they have to try and make sense of in order to steer the mediation process in a positive direction.
So just to back up for a second, so the mediation team, so you've been working in particular on the Yemen conflict, and it's not something I know much about at all, but other than when I've talked to people about it who do know about it, they say, oh, it's very complex, and it seems to be the perfect use case for what you're talking about here. The question I was going to ask, actually, I was just thinking about it, was you were mentioning, Felix, that traditionally conflicts have been interstate, and now we're seeing a lot of within state or complex, many actors, some state and some non-state. I was thinking, in a traditional conflict, the mediator might be in a separate country that's, not involved in the conflict, like a neutral country. But who are the mediators in this case, and what sort of people are they? So
usually you have UN missions that are coordinating the entire mediation process, but you obviously have many different organizations that help with aspects of a mediation process that are specialized in particular areas. So, for instance, you might have organizations that deal with the aspect of constitution making in a particular of a mediation process, or others who are specialized in particular minorities that might be part of a conflict. Right. So it becomes a really complicated puzzle of actors that are involved also in the mediation process. In this particular case, we were working for an organization that was supporting the larger mediation process in preparing basically high-level negotiations, in trying to deal with the substantive aspects of the conflict. So that might be questions around how do you organize the Yemeni state, what are the key kind of conflict aspects, and these then feed into the main agreement and the main settlement, if there is any at some point.
And is the organization an NGO or?
It's technically speaking an intergovernmental organization.
What was the origin of this particular research project that you guys were involved in? And why did you come across the idea, or how did the idea originate of looking at the peace dialogue transcripts in the first place?
I've been working for quite a while in another context, in a similarly kind of complex post-war scenario in Libya on constitution making. And back then I got in touch, or I had quite a lot of interaction with that particular organization. And basically I had a phone call where the leader of the mediation team explained to me what they were doing in Yemen at the point. And it just happened that I was at the Turing Institute back then. And I knew Rob and Miguel. And basically the problem that he was telling me about was that he was totally overwhelmed with the amount of data that they had. Yeah. He was very interested in the work that we were doing in citizen participation and organizing different bits of data. So that to a degree that it's becoming a little bit more usable and understandable. And that seemed to be a perfect match, the work that Rob and Miguel were doing. And so we kind of explored the idea initially a little bit, looked at the available data, and then basically took it from there. Cool.
Perhaps one of you could tell us a bit about this transcript data itself. You know, where did it come from? What makes it useful? Were there any limitations to its use for analysis?
What we had at hand, and that's I think the beauty of our project is, and that's the reason why this hasn't been done very often, is that you don't have access to data that is coming from within peace negotiations. So usually you have a lot of development at the moment where you use AI to understand contextual aspects of a conflict. So for instance, you analyze Twitter data, social media, etc., or you do conflict prediction using different kinds of data. But you very rarely get data that's coming from within a peace negotiation. And this is what we had. Basically what that organization did was that they had taken not verbatim notes, but rough notes of 2 years worth of peace negotiations. But they were fairly well structured and representative of the key arguments of the different parties. And were in chronological order, so I think that there were a couple, maybe Miguel can add a little bit to the way that the data was structured. But generally speaking, it was these types of rough notes that were representing what was being talked about in these negotiations, and also representative to a degree of what the parties were saying. Obviously, there are limitations in the data. There's always a little bit of bias that comes in when you through the process of note-taking. Exactly, the original notes were in Arabic and you have to translate it. So
I was going to ask that actually. Yeah, it was what's the language? But so with the people writing the notes, presume, they translated it.
Yeah, exactly. So there's obviously a risk of bias, but generally speaking, it's the best type of data that we have, right? In an ideal case scenario, we would have perhaps verbatim notes, but we would still have the language problem, obviously, that would still need to be translated, although Rob and Miguel may kind of flesh that out a little bit. But generally speaking, it's the best type of data that we have for these kind of processes. And as far as we know, the first time that researchers have been given access to this type of data. And I think that's what makes it extremely exciting.
I think the thing that makes it sound interesting to me is the fact that it's over 2 years and that it's, you've got a particular format, presumably being, what was the frequency over that 2 year period? Was this discussions happening every month or?
I think they had one meeting a month, which then lasted
very long meeting.
Lasted over an entire day.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So this is a lot of data.
Yes.
And what's interesting, also, for example, the issue about language. I think it's very important because most of this technology on machine learning and NLP is focused on English because, most of the companies are working with English. There's much more data that they can use to train the models or websites and everything, but actually most of these conflicts probably are not originally used in English. So this is a huge limitation. We have the lack here of having the mediation organization who could translate the information and then we could analyze it. But probably for all the cases that is not going to be the scenario. So I think this is one thing that is important to start developing these technologies, to be able to work also in languages that have...
There's a lot of languages which are what's referred to as being underserved, in that there aren't the resources that you would use to train models for a particular language, and Arabic is a case in point. So it's just to be hoped that there will be language resources for these languages developed in time, and that will certainly, I think, make our ambitions to continue this work more achievable.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about, isn't it? So I guess for the listeners' benefit, the kind of AI or machine learning we're talking about here, as you mentioned earlier, is natural language processing. Mm-hmm. And, without needing to go into the details, it's pretty obvious from what you said that it depends which language you're using, how effective these tools are going to be. And when it comes to things like machine learning, that a lot of that comes down to training data.
Exactly.
Have the machine learning models been trained on a particular language, then they're probably not going to be any use on a different language.
That's correct. Yeah.
But yeah. So in this case, you were working with English transcripts, I guess. Anyway, so but it's a very interesting point. So one of the tasks that your research sought to address was categorizing the peace dialogue transcripts, saving the mediators time in doing this manually. So how did you go about doing this categorization process?
Well, there were two things we wanted to do. One was to take categories of issues that the mediating team themselves were already using, because they'd identified those categories through the process of organising and listening to the dialogues. Mm-hmm. But the other thing we thought would be interesting to do would be to see if there are what we call latent issues, which the NLP tools could help surface, and this might add then a different perspective onto the data. So we actually worked to develop two different approaches. One was to try and identify text that spoke to the already identified issues. Mm-hmm. For example, the Constitution, right, the army, or resources, and so on and so forth. But the other was then to see, well, can we find issues that the mediating team maybe hasn't spotted, which might be helpful for them to know about. So this was a two-pronged approach, and Miguel can tell us more about how we went about developing those models using the resources, language models that were available for us.
Yeah, I think also this is also an interesting approach for this kind of problems, because in the first case, when we're working with basically the issues that the mediators already know that are useful, we are sticking to their view on the conflict. Mm-hmm. So basically in this case, the machine learning basically makes easier to do the work that they already are doing. So basically we can maybe analyze more data.
So they've decided the categories, the issues, as Rob mentioned, and then it's putting the transcripts into those categories.
Yeah. So in that case, the machine learning doesn't help them to think differently about the conflict. It just makes their life easier, because you have these machines that do the work for you. But in the other case, when we are just extracting the issues from the text itself, it's a bit different, because the machine learning help you to think in your problem in a very different way as you were not thinking before. In that case, in the first scenario, basically what we were doing when they already gave us these issues, they gave us also like keywords for the different issues that identify each of these relevant issues. And then we use these model languages that are trained to understand when people are talking about the same issue, even if they are not using this specific word. So basically these models are trained with large amount of data that are able to identify synonyms, or basically when people refer to the one issue, even when they don't use the relevant words. And that helps us to find these categories. But in the second case, where we extract the issues from the text, what we do is we just take all the text together and we do a global analysis, basically looking at the frequency of the words. So basically looking, okay, what are the relevant words that are appearing in each of the texts, comparing the different texts and so on. And let's see if the machine can automatically organize the documents using a small set of very relevant words, and the machine can tell us already, okay, there is one issue, I don't know what is the issue, but many of these documents are really connected to this issue and have to do with these 3, 4, 5 words that will help us to identify what is the issue. Okay, and this is very interesting because then it provides a very different overview of the conflict to the mediators.
And were there any issues in particular that the NLP or the machine learning techniques recognised that were different somehow from the categories that the mediators would have expected?
Yeah, I think there was very different. Is some things that they recognize as relevant then when looking at the documents and the text. So it's not that they were surprised and they just discovered something that had nothing to do, because of course they have been working these 2 years within the conflict. But the priority of the issues suddenly changed. Now it's not anymore their list ordered by what they think is relevant in their heads and relevance for talking about this problem, but it was more just the priorities coming from the text itself. So if the parties and the people involved have been talking a lot about one issue, that will go into the top. So it lets the text prioritize itself the issue. So this is a very different approach.
And so the relative importance then is, I guess, to how much something is discussed, but would it also be useful for them to, I don't know, look at the things which were less discussed and maybe focus on those issues as well? Was it helpful in that context?
Yes, and it's important to remember that these tools are not magic. They don't do the analysis autonomously. They are really useful in helping a member of the mediation team, in this case, to find relevant structure and content in the data, which they can then explore in more detail. So it doesn't remove the need for the mediating team to bring their own understanding and their own efforts to analysing the data, but it helps to uncover structure that makes that process more efficient.
And I think that another thing that would be interesting to learn about this is, as well as the techniques you're using to do this, I guess you would call it categorization of issues. What was the platform by which the mediators were able to sort of access what you'd done in the categorization? Did you have to build software tools to allow them to do that?
Yes, we did. But before we get into that, perhaps we should also mention that one of the issues that the mediating team is interested in is whether the parties are moving apart or getting closer together around a particular issue. So apart from being able to map the content of the dialogues to different issues, which will allow the mediating team to explore those issues in more detail and identify who's talking about that issue from what party and so forth, we're also able to demonstrate if the parties are moving closer or further apart around particular issues, which is important when you think about the job of managing a dialogue. You want to know if it's working, exactly, which turns out to be important for a number of reasons, not least for planning the next stage of the negotiation process. So those are the two sort of really important, I think, tools that came out of the work.
So the two being the categorization of issues we've already discussed, and the second thing being
measuring
how do you measure how close people are on a given issue,
and how that's changing over time. We had 2 years of data, so we were able to measure over that period of time whether over a particular issue which parties were moving closer together or which were moving further apart. And I think that was perhaps something that we hadn't anticipated at the beginning, but it emerged out of the very systematic way that we worked with the mediating team. We had weekly meetings with them where we explored the results of preliminary analysis, and we got their feedback, and that helped them then to understand more about what could be done, things they hadn't perhaps thought about at the beginning. that all emerged out of that process that we had of participatory design and development of the tools. And I think the two different kinds of analysis that we're able to do now have proved very useful to the mediating team.
I think maybe connected to that, I think this is an important point, because when we are trying to bring technology to the applications and to people who maybe are not so familiar with technology, always there is a risk that the people who are going to use this technology look at the technicians or researchers as the experts on technology. Right. So basically the expert is saying what the technology does, what are the limitation, and how it's going to be used. And usually it tends to be this really a bit hierarchical relationship in that sense. So it's very rare, at least at the beginning, that the person that at the end is going to be really using the technology is able to define how they want to use technology. First, because they are not familiar with technology, and also because still are not able maybe to define the limits. So for example, when we started this project, at the beginning we were focusing more on this first part of the project, the categorization, because it's a much more common use of this kind of technology and language technology and for that. So we basically came up with, okay, first we can do this. And it's through these meetings with them that we understood, okay, they really need this second application. For them, it's really even much more important, the categorization, this measuring this distance between parties. So now we have to be able to change your technology to fit their needs. And this only can happen if you are really working together through
in that collaborative process.
Otherwise it's impossible. And then at the end, they end doing whatever you tell them that is going to be done, because you're, let's say, the expert on that.
This is a really interesting point, because I feel like these mediators have done a good job in that they've come to you as researchers, as opposed to going to like some company that has a software tool who's going to come to them and say, yes, here we go. We've got a black box software tool that has categorized your data for you, and here's the outputs. Whereas you as researchers can go to them and say, well, listen, this is a research project. So this is what we think will work, and let's have the conversation back and forth and then you end up coming with a slightly different goal in addition to the original one, which is really interesting.
And there's another aspect to it, I think, that is extremely important, especially in these very highly sensitive contexts, is the way that the output is being interpreted in the end. Because obviously there's always a danger, it's what Rob explained a little bit earlier, that you take whatever is being presented as an analysis as truth, right? And there's perhaps a little bit of a temptation of taking this and saying, okay, well, this is how the dialogue works. But really, there's a lot of work that needs to be going into the interpretation of whatever the output is. And I think our constant collaboration, or kind of the weekly meetings, prepared the mediators to use the tool in a responsible way and in a way that is really meaningful to them. And not falling into the traps of whatever the data is being,
Of assuming that the algorithms can do the work.
Exactly. Yeah.
It has to be a partnership in which the analytical expertise of the people involved, the mediating team, remains at the centre of the process.
Yeah, this is a software to assist them, not to do it for them.
Yes.
And how do you go about? You obviously the frequency of meetings you've mentioned a couple of times, which sounds like it's really important. But how do you go about sort of explaining the limitations of what you're doing, and but not just the limitations, but what it can do for them, to people who are not themselves software engineers or computer scientists?
There's no set process for that. The important thing is to provide support to the people you're working with, to encourage them to ask questions, to articulate what they think they would like to come out of the project, and then taking that and working with it and coming back with, well, here's what we think that means. We can produce this output or that output. How does that match with your expectations? And the idea is to work up a joint understanding where we learn what their objectives are and they learn what is technically possible. And these two different viewpoints can come together. It really involves a lot of listening. And indeed, we made transcripts of our meetings with our partners so that we had a detailed record of what they were saying. And we could refer to that when it then came to, subsequent discussions. So the key here is to really devote a lot of effort to listen and to try and interpret back to the people you're working with what you think they're saying, and that way build up an understanding which is grounded in the realities of what they're trying to do.
And so out of this process emerged this second goal of measuring the distance that the parties involved in the peace dialogue, how far they were on any given issue from each other. So I'm interested to know, how do you go about measuring such a thing? It sounds like something that would be very, very hard to measure indeed.
It is, and I think I'm not aware of work like that being done in other application areas. I mean, Miguel can again speak to in more technical detail how we did that.
Yeah, basically what we did, we used these machine learning models that are trained with large amount of data. This also to just to simplify a bit, in case somebody is listening and don't really know how this works. Basically, these models are trained with tens of thousands of books and web pages and whatever, and learn to identify how sentences are constructed, what words go together, what the meanings probably are similar or related or whatever. So they really understand the structure of language and can have a kind of representation of each of the words in each context.
And these are the sort of NLP, natural language processing models.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is what usually is called language models. And then when you have one language model, in this case trained on these English books, web pages, whatever, then you can use it for new documents, in this case, these dialogues. So in that case, what we did is, at the end, it was something really simple. Basically, we take all the sentences that each party is saying about each of the issues, and the model already has a mathematical, a numerical representation of each of the words. So in some sense, the model can identify each word by some numbers that you can represent in a plot, basically in also a simple image. You can imagine that if we draw these words that have a similar meaning are going to appear together in the plot, and words that have very different meaning are going to appear very far from each other. It's a bit of simplification, but it's this kind of idea that then is really represented by these numbers. So basically, if you are talking, for example, about one issue, and then you start adding up these words, these numbers, you're going to keep going in the same direction, because all these words point to the same direction. While if you suddenly change the topic and talk about other things, then you will start moving in this plot to other direction of the plot. So at the end, basically, we just need to do that. We take what one party has said about one issue, all the words, all the sentences, and we try to see in which direction in this plot of words they are moving. So if two parties basically are using the same kind of words, the same kind of meanings, they are talking very similar to each other, they go into the same direction.
I see, right.
And if two parties, even where they're talking about the same issue, they use very different concepts, very different meaning, because they're really opposing in what they are proposing, they will move very far from each other. So it's a simple representation, but it's based on how already these words can be represented in these kind of plots and spaces where the directions, to simplify, have a meaning related to the word. So basically we just...
So to use a perhaps oversimplified example, imagine if one of the parties in the peace talks was using sort of overwhelmingly negative language on one particular issue, and the other party was using much more positive language, then you would see that divergence in the...
But these representations, these numerical representations, are very complex. So that could be one of the dimensions, like positive or negative, or you already would see like how they are apart from each other. But it could be also just on many different axes. So it could really get a lot of knowledge about what people are talking about. Maybe it's not specifically positive or negative, but maybe, I don't know, we're talking about the presidency and they are mentioning one structure of presidency that use some type of words, and then another type of presidency that use other words. So really any kind of dimension.
If you're calling it a distance metric, then the larger would mean they're further apart.
Yeah.
So you want to minimize it in a sense.
Exactly.
And were there like okay, well maybe I'm skipping ahead to the results here, but were there, like, given certain issues, was the metric really high for some and really low for others?
This is what it seems to appear from the data. Again, as we said, it's important to have a interpretation of this data by the mediators. So we cannot just think, because this is what Felix was mentioning before. Now it could be, sometimes there is this temptation of looking just at this number and say, okay, no, this is 5, this is 10, that's it. No, this is the problematic issue and this is not. This is just a clue that then the mediators have to take to go back to the data by themselves, look really at the transcript and agree or disagree with the interpretation. Okay, so it's a patterns and clues that we found that then we gave them back to the mediators, and they may agree in some cases, and in some cases maybe not. Maybe there's a case where really the kind of discussions and the text was really similar, so the machine was not able to identify huge differences, but there's small subtle differences that are crucial, and then the mediator said, no, well, here we know that there is much more difference than, but at least we give them a first approach that makes them a bit easier, or also to look at issues that maybe they were not so concerned about, and then they can go and check it again.
Imagining in the case where there is a certain issue which they think, well, that issue is okay, but then they see that there's high scoring on the distance between the two parties, and then they may think, actually maybe we should revisit that, and maybe even vice versa. Although you just spoke to a caveat of that, which is that it, in more nuanced issues, perhaps the language might come up as being similar, yet that doesn't necessarily mean that they're on the same page. Rob, were you about to say something about that? Or
Well, no, just to reinforce the point that NLP remains quite a blunt instrument. These language models have certainly made it possible to deliver more complex, sophisticated analysis of textual data, but they don't replace the need to, or they don't themselves constitute ground truth, if you like. They provide ways to interrogate the data. They suggest particular parts of the data to look at more closely. They may challenge assumptions, which leads to validation or checking of those assumptions. So I think they help to make the process overall more robust by providing pointers to where the data can be or should be looked at more closely. And in that way, I think can help to make the process overall more systematic, more robust. But it's not a substitute for the effort and human expertise.
It's actually enabling them more.
It's a design to assist them and perhaps can make the process more robust, more systematic, more reproducible, and thereby it will deliver benefits because it's able to do that.
And just to go back to the question I had earlier, which was if you are one of these people who is the mediators, using the software tools that you built for them to sort of see the results of your machine learning stuff, what would that look like to them, and what would they do? How would they then know which part of the transcript to go back to?
I think in this case, first we try to organize the work together with them, so it was useful for them. So what we try first is to the first part, to categorize this all these different texts of the dialogues in a simple database where it would be easy for them to just identify each of the texts with one of tag, let's say, one category, and they could just filter by these categories and find the text. So to make it very easy, not a complex, not a software or complex thing something they could use easily. Then, of course, the next part, when we are producing these new graphs and plotting the distance and so on, at the end we need to produce a specific report for this conflict. And this, of course, that was also this first research work where we are just starting to test these tools and so on. But the objective also of this is to then keep working on this and to be able then to produce tools that maybe are easy to use by themselves, so they can really play with them and introduce new documents and new texts and new everything, and keep using not only in this case but in other scenarios. So, we are really starting to work on these issues, and this is the first time that this is being used. So it's still a long time until. Yeah.
So bearing that in mind, that it is a research project, you said, and this is the first time that these tools have been used for this particular task. Are the conflict mediation team you collaborated with still using these tools, like sort of in the field now? I mean, I know the conflict's still ongoing, so is the peace talks still ongoing, and what's the impact that your research is having with them at the moment?
I think we had very positive feedback on the way that the tool worked. I think that, as Miguel said, there needs to be a couple of improvements to make them use the tool on a regular basis. But I think they have already used the tool to in several presentations with, be it the UN or different sponsors, to really show a different, give a different perspective on the way that they have been working in the dialogue and the impact that they have had in the dialogue, and also to emphasize what was happening. And I think they're very, very keen on, because they're involved in several other processes as well, to translate the experiences from Yemen into other countries. So at the moment we're negotiating with them, we're kind of exploring whether there would be ways of using similar tools in another dialogue.
Yeah, and I think the feedback that we've had, as Felix was saying, is been very positive. We produce essentially historical analysis on the data that's already been collected, and the next stage will be to use the tools on new data and to bring it into a conflict resolution process, so that it's used in a more active way, to support that process. But the feedback we've had is that they think that this provides a new approach to conflict mediation, which they think needs to be adopted more widely. That they feel it will make the processes more manageable, that it will make them more reproducible, it will lead to more robust and perhaps more productive outcomes. And so they're very much, I think, endorsing how effectively a new methodology is emerging out of the project, which involves the use of these tools alongside their expertise. So it is, in some respects, I think, from my interpretation of that feedback, quite potentially transformational for how they will go about doing dialogue, conflict mediation in the future.
Well, I don't know if it's too early to ask this, but I mean, you mentioned, Felix, that they'd spoken to the UN about sort of their results of having used the tool that's come from your research. Is there any sort of particular outcome from their, having used your tool on the peace dialogue that they think that they wouldn't have been able to achieve without it?
That's impossible to answer. But this is because the process in Yemen has basically stalled, and so they weren't able to implement the findings, or basically the learnings from that project in a new process at the moment. But I think on the whole, what is important to I think it's really important to highlight the limitations of a tool like this, but it's also perhaps worthwhile to think about how we did things previously, right? Previously, we had manual reports that were written up. You always depended on the interpretation of a particular proceeding, on how a mediator or a particular person involved that was interpreting these processes. If you look at a process that is drawn out over 5 or 6 years, you can imagine how you build up, prejudices. You have a particular interpretation of things. You have changing staff, and then the process. It's very hard to understand what is actually happening and kind of distance yourself from this interpretation. I think what our tool is offering is just a new perspective. The tools, these approaches are offering a new perspectives on these dialogues that will, I think, just offer perhaps new ways of looking at these dialogues and adapting these dialogues, and perhaps even to provide some sort of better scrutiny, accountability for the mediators that are involved in these processes.
Are you optimistic that 10 years from now this will have started to move towards a common practice, or that better techniques will have been developed?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It happens always, no? All the technology that starts to be useful and efficient, of course, spread, because why are you not going to be more efficient? No? And also coming back to what I mentioned before, this is a very particular this kind of technologies are very particular kind of technologies, because we are used to previous technologies, kind of machines that basically help us to be more efficient in what we are already doing. So this is a tradition interpretation of technology. But in that case, we have technology that can, on one side, make us be more efficient than we're already doing. But the other side, this is a technology that is in this framework of artificial intelligence that had to do with intelligence, had to do with being able to think in a way that we were not able to think before. So they are expanding our thinking abilities or like intellectual abilities to analyze, in this case, language or dialogues or whatever, as we were not able to do before. So it's different. It's not just we are more efficient and that's why we need to use technology. It also allows to think in things or look at things in a much powerful way. So this is a great complement to what we're.
That's really quite sort of profound thing you've said there, which I'm going to ask you sort of a more general question based on that, which is that do you see AI in quotation marks as not as maybe a lot of people in the public might see it as sort of a thing that's separate from us, and it is separate from us, but it's an enhancement to our intelligence, or that's basically what it is. That's what software is, right?
I absolutely think that is the way, and especially in this case that we are talking about language, because our thinking is strongly connected to language and how do we use language. So if that helps us to do different things with language or read things in a different way, or being able to, like this, not just take thousands and thousands of documents and to be able to read all of them, compare all of them and understand the main ideas for all of them together, is something that you can never do manually. It doesn't matter how many people you have, how many time you have. It's a difference. So it expands what we can do. So I think this is a crucial difference. But I'm the optimistic here.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
Miguel is always super optimistic about what machine learning can do. I think the whole journey that I've had so far with Rob and Miguel was obviously also something really mind expanding, and I can see a lot of value in the ways that these tools have been working. But I can also see how really tricky it is to implement these things in a way that is responsible and meaningful, because you will have to really develop a deep understanding of why the tools are producing particular results, how they are producing the results. And it's very easy to just look at whatever the machine is outputting and take it for granted. And that's a lazy approach that many people, me included, would take very quickly and jump into conclusions. So I think, as much as I agree with Miguel that the technology is getting better and better and that it is a way in the future, I think we have to think a lot about how we are implementing it, how we are using it, and also the type of knowledge that we will have to acquire in order to use these tools responsibly.
It seems like there's a little bit of a trade-off between being as robust as possible versus being as responsive as possible, because as Rob was saying, like in this case it's like you analysing historical data, and you could spend years perfecting your models on this particular conflict that's already occurred in the past, but that wouldn't be of any use. Whereas, as you said, like to be able to do something active like in an ongoing conflict would obviously be actually useful, but then it comes with the downside of how much time do you have to figure out exactly how your language machine learning software really works, and how to not take its results as just.
And this is what we continually emphasise. As I said earlier, this is not magic. It's not better than human understanding. It's a tool that can support and augment human understanding of data. And so it should be treated in that way, and not as a substitute for the effort of actually understanding the data. It's a way of helping to do that, but it's not a substitute for it. And I think to me, that's an important thing to emphasise about if we look to the future and applications of what we call AI. I prefer the term machine learning, because I think in most cases, if not all, I don't believe in the concept of artificial intelligence. I think it's an oxymoron, to be honest. So I think we have to develop a much better and more sophisticated understanding of these technologies that avoids loading onto them capabilities that they can't deliver, because that way leads to, I think, very potentially dangerous outcomes.
Felix, did you have something you wanted to say about that as well?
No, I was just like to just use a very practical example. Because you were making the point that I don't want this learning to be misinterpreted as everyone has to become a data scientist and understand very precisely how the NLP tools are calculating the distance between. I don't think that this is the point. I think it's more, how do we interpret this? And there's I think a temptation to, once you abstract the data from or what you see from human production, it's tempting to see it as as what you are seeing. So let's be a little bit more concrete. If someone writes up a report from as a human writes up a report about how a mediation process has been going, okay, this is a person who has written it, they have interpreted it in a particular way, and so I will have to interpret whatever this person has written in there also in a particular way. I think there's a little bit of a danger that once you put a machine in between and you see a report that is produced or that builds on machine-based data, to take it as a non-interpretation, as like some kind of as a truth, as Rob says. So, for instance, we had one response to the tool where they were saying, "Oh yeah, but so if you take the party distances, right, you can see that some parties are closer together and others are further away, right? But we can't even take the data that we have there as any kind of real truth, because the parties will present themselves in a particular way. They will say things they don't really mean because they use language strategically. Okay. So they might be saying, I really want a presidency in, month one, and on the other one, the other day they say, I'd prefer a different type of system, right? A political system. Yeah. So it's not like, oh yeah, these are the party distances and this is what it really is, but you have to interpret not only the way that the data is produced, but also what lies behind that data. Right. And I think you would do it more easily if someone writes up things, and you would, because you have a more natural inclination to to question these things. Once you put the machine in between, at least for me, I had the experience that you have a tendency to say, oh yeah, oh, this is how it goes. Actually not. You have to think about the process in multiple ways, dimensions. And this is what I mean by you have to understand and learn how to interpret these things. Not so much the tools themselves, the technicality, but what is it that you're seeing. And that's, I think, perhaps even a cultural thing, perhaps, that will need to change.
It's a matter of experience, I think. That we need a lot of applications of these tools again and again and again until we really start building the culture of what do they mean, how they use.
I think Felix's point about understanding the underlying processes that generate the data is really important.
Exactly.
The fact that, to a certain extent, parties involved in these kinds of processes, these peace negotiations, are exercising a sort of performativity, right?
Oh, right.
They are presenting themselves in certain ways at certain times because there are tactical and strategic objectives that, are driving the way that they present themselves. And, you cannot, if you remove understanding of those processes that the mediating team have because they've been exposed to them over many different situations, then you're losing something from the understanding of that data, and so you need that expertise to complement what the machine can do, to really have a more robust understanding of what it means at any particular time around any particular issue and the position of any particular party, for example. So understanding how the data is produced is critical, and that's expertise, one of the kinds of expertise that these people bring to those processes. And we don't have a way of substituting for that, and I don't think we want to. We want to make it easier to exercise that expertise so that they can be more confident in the conclusions that they draw.
It's augmenting the expertise, which goes back to what Miguel was saying, Well, thanks very much to the three of you for agreeing to come on the Turing podcast. Just before we let you go, where can our listeners find out more about this research online?
We are just completing a paper which will be published, we're hopeful, about in a journal, Data for Policy. We're just making revisions now, and actually we'll submit it next week. And I think that's open access, so...
But we already have a first version of the paper that is public. It's in archive. And it's mediation, machine learning for mediation in armed conflicts. Is the title. So.
And we have papers on other related work that we've been doing on citizen participation in democratic processes. A number of papers which explore very similar themes in the sense that we're trying to understand how to apply data science to solve real-world problems in the understanding of textual data.
Wow, fantastic.
I'm sure we can give you a few links to go with the...
Yes, we can drop some links in the episode notes. All right, Rob, Felix and Miguel, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very
for
much.
having us.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. The Turing podcast is produced by Dan Whitfield for the Alan Turing Institute. The show is hosted by me, B. Costa Gomes, Ed Calstreet, Joe Dungate, Christina Last, and Anika York. Music for this podcast is produced by Jam and Sun. You can listen and follow via the link in the description or by searching Jam and Sun on Instagram.